In the 8th chapter of the book of Romans, there's a passage which many Christians hold very dear to their hearts, and which many Christians can quote from memory. Romans 8, verse 28. The King James says, "All things therefore work together for good to them that love God, and to those who are called according to His purpose." I'd like to read it to you from the NIV. The NIV says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." This is the statement by the Apostle Paul of the providence of God. And not a single one of us would be here this morning were it not for the providence of God. There's not a one of us who can say that his life has been rougher or more difficult than the Apostle Paul. There's no one who had more reason to be discouraged in life than the Apostle Paul himself had. And we'll look at that a little further. But with all of the blessings he had received, with all of the difficulties that had come his way in life, he was able to say, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." I'd like to take that verse, phrase by phrase, and discuss it with you this morning, and talk about God's providence. First of all, let's look at the three words, "in all things." He says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him." This is the most difficult part of the verse. We can understand how that God works for our good in a lot of things. It's easy to see when some great blessing comes our way, when something good comes our way. It's easy to see that God is working for our good. The difficulty comes when the bad things come along, when the hardships of life present themselves to us. But this verse indicates to us that in both the bitter and the sweet, God is working for us. In both that which is pleasant as well as that which is unpleasant, God is working for us. You as a young person may remember the time you received a bicycle as a gift. Mom and Dad went out and somewhere bought a bicycle and brought it home and said, "Son or daughter, here is a new bicycle." Now that's a nice thing to remember. And a young person would find it very easy to be encouraged about that and enthusiastic about it, and remember that and say, "Well, sure, God was working for my good. My parents were working for my good when that happened. They were thinking about me. They wanted me to be happy, and so they got me a bicycle." Or maybe it's a car. Maybe it was a car. Maybe your parents presented you with a car. Maybe they made it possible for you to have a car. And you remember that time, "Boy, I am really proud of that car. They really were good to me in giving me that car or making it possible for me to have that car." But what about the time when you broke your leg? What about the time when you broke an arm? What about the time when you were in an accident? Is it easy to understand that God was working for your good? No, it's not easy to understand that He was working for my good in that also. It's not easy for me to see how that can turn out to my good. How can a broken arm do me any good? How can a broken leg, how can being in an accident help me? How can being sick help me? And we as adults are the same. We can easily understand those things that are good, those things that are helpful, those experiences in life that are pleasant to us. It's easy to understand that. It's easy to understand Paul saying that in those good things of life, in those pleasant things of life, God works for the good of those who love Him. But that's not what He said. It's kind of like the marriage ceremony, which says, in sickness and in health, for better or for worse, in good times and in bad times, in prosperity and in hard times. That's the way marriage is. It's a contract for life. It's a commitment made by one to the other in spite of the difficulties that may come. Our commitment, of course, to the Lord is the same way. But what's hard for us to understand is that how any good can come out of the difficulties of life, the temptations of life, those things that produce pain for us, those things that are hard for us to adjust to, those things that wear our patience thin, and those things that are difficult to accept. You may remember as an adult when you married the most beautiful girl you ever saw. She accepted your proposal, and you became husband and wife. And you can see how, well, now that really worked for my good. She's the best thing that ever happened to me. And she stood by me faithfully all of these years. But what about a divorce? What about sickness in the family? What about a death in the family? What about a child who dies before it's a year old? How are we to understand that kind of event in our lives? Mona and I and Peggy Downing were privileged to attend some of the evangelism workshop in San Antonio the last 3 days. Brother Stanley Shipp from St. Louis, Missouri was there talking about insights into the life of Christ. And he told about a young couple in St. Louis in the McKnight Road congregation of the Church of Christ there who had a deformed child born to them. The child had no nose whatsoever. And there were just gaping holes in the front of this child's head and face instead of the normally formed nose and mouth that we normally see. And the doctor said, well, you probably, first of all, they said, the child won't live but just a few days. And then they said, you surely won't want to take the child home with you. And they said, oh, yes, we will. And the doctor said, you'll perhaps want to put the child in an institution. Oh, not on your life. And as soon as they were able, they brought this child to church. And instead of getting off in the corner somewhere and trying to hide their child from others, they stood in the foyer. And if someone came along, they said, we want you to meet our baby. Hideous looking. Stanley said, occasionally someone will come and say, but why does God allow a thing like that to happen? And he said, you know, I want to answer so a dummy cat like you can learn to love a person like that. So that God may test you and see how capable you are of loving the unlovable as He has done for us. God's discipline is something that's difficult for us to understand and often difficult for us to accept. The Hebrew writer said in Hebrews 12, verses 10 and 11, our fathers disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in His holiness. There's the reason, that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. This is difficult for children to understand. Why do I have to sit still? Why do I have to go there? Why do I have to eat this? Why do I have to go to bed at a certain time? Why do my parents want me to come in at a certain time? Discipline is hard to accept, but discipline is for our best. Those of you who have raised children, whose children are grown, many of you have had those children come back to you, we have, and say to you, you did the right thing. It was hard to accept at the time, but I see now it was the best for me. And the older we become in the Christian faith, the more mature we are, the more progress we make as Christians, the more we're going to look back to God our Father and say, God, I couldn't understand then why it was, but now I see more clearly. In James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, James said, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." And so difficulties of life have a very good purpose in the lives of us all. We can't see clearly the reason. We can't see the future. We don't know what God is accomplishing in us, but He's working in us in all things for our good. Not only the good things, but also the difficult things, the bad things, the unpleasant things. It was so in the life of the Apostle Paul. And he recounted many of those things in the 2 Corinthian letter, chapter 11, beginning with verse 23. He named many of the difficulties he had experienced. He said, "Are they servants of Christ? I am out of my mind to talk like this." He was boasting, you see. "I am more. I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen." Sounds like he may have lived in Houston a while. "In danger from the Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false brothers. I have labored and toiled, and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst, and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Besides everything else, I face daily the pressure of my concern for all the churches. Who is weak, and I do not feel weak? Who is led into sin, and I do not inwardly burn?" Paul was a very normal person. He suffered under the things that are here listed. They were difficult for him, but he recognized the good that came from them. But back in this passage, that same 8th chapter of the book of Romans, there's almost a commentary given from verse 35 following. Paul said, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, or hardship, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through Him who loved us." God really does love us. God loves us when we get a new bicycle. He loves us when we're given a new car. He loves us when we marry a good wife. But He loves us in those other times as well. He hasn't forsaken us just because times may be difficult. And so we see in this the universality of God's working in all things He's working for our good. And let's look at another statement, part of this verse. God works for the good. There's a harmony expressed in this phrase, God works for the good. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17, Paul says, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all." Well, what about this trouble in life? What about these difficulties that we experience? Paul says, well, they're light, they're momentary, and what are they achieving for us? What are they working in us? They are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. And so good is coming from it. Harmony is coming out of it. And that's the idea further developed in the book of James, from which I quoted chapter 1 before. Down in verse 12, he said, "Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him." It's easy for anybody when it's easy, when all things are pleasant. But it's when the going gets rough that the rough get going, as someone put it. It's when the real test comes that shows our temper, what we're made of. And James says that man who perseveres under trial, who stands the test, is going to be blessed. He will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him. Well, the phrase says God works for the good. What kind of good? Not our temporary good, our eternal good. Not now necessarily, but then. Not present, but future. Not our physical good necessarily, but our spiritual good. Stanley Shipp said about that baby that I mentioned to you that actually did die after about 6 weeks. He said that little baby held in the arms of its parents there did more preaching than I'll ever do in all my life. From the difficulties of life, much good comes that we're often unable to see. And these things produce in us, Paul himself said 3 chapters before the one we're reading from with our text, Romans 5, verse 2 beginning, "Through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings." We rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. What a great characteristic, a great virtue for every person to possess. Suffering produces perseverance. What does perseverance produce? The offshoot, the resulting fruit from perseverance, he says, is character. Who is it among us who does not need an improved character? And what's the product, the byproduct of character? Character, he says, produces hope. And every one of us needs hope. Hope is the anchor of life. Hope is the thing that keeps us firm, rooted, and grounded, and keeps us from going off in 40 different directions at one time under the difficulties and pressures of life. Yes, these things that we're talking about, the good and the bad, in verse 29 of that 8th chapter of Romans, Paul says, "Cause something to be brought about in our lives. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the likeness of His Son. In all of this, God works so that we may be transformed and conformed to the likeness of His Son. We need to be more like Christ. The only Jesus that some people will ever see is the Jesus they see living in you and me. And that's why it's important that we be conformed to the likeness of His Son. Let's take a couple of other words from that verse 28. Paul said, "We know." And there's a great confidence expressed on the part of a great Christian. We know in two different ways. We know, first of all, by revelation. This is the way Paul knew, and we know the same way. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 1, he says, "Now we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands." Here again, he's assuring, we know this. And so we know it by revelation. Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12, "I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that He is able to keep that which I have committed to Him against that day." We sing the song, "We'll understand it all by and by. Tempted and tried, we're all made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long, why the difficulties of life." Paul says we know by revelation, but we also know by experience. There are a lot of things, surely, that we will never understand until we get to heaven, until we can talk with Paul personally, until we can talk with the Lord and find out. But even a few years on this earth, even a few years, having experienced many of the things that we've talked about this morning, teach us many lessons. And we come to know also by experience. I can see many of these lessons much more clearly than I could 20, 25 years ago. And I'm sure many of you can say the same thing as well. There's only one qualifying remark in this verse. Only one reservation. All things work together for good. God is working in all things for the good of those who love Him. Not all of these experiences in life turn out for the good of all people. There are a lot of people who, when difficulties come, turn sour. They become bitter. Some commit suicide because they cannot see a framework for these things, for the experiences of life. They can't see a purpose in going on. They can't see how any good could come from the unpleasant experiences which they receive. But this reservation, this qualification, helps us more to understand. It's for those who love Him. He's loved us. And when that person, very knowledgeable in the law of Moses, came to Christ and asked Him what he considered to be the most important command of all, Mark chapter 12 and verse 30, Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. The greatest commandment for anybody living is to love God. John defines that commandment. To love God is to keep His commands in 1 John chapter 2. Yes, for those who love God, for those who keep His commands, God is working in every experience of their lives for good, in order that they might be transformed and conformed to the likeness and the image of His only Son. We may say this by way of conclusion even. We may say that if something turns out not to be to our good, in the final analysis, in the conclusion of our lives, we may be sure that it's because we don't love God. When we love God, He's not going to give us anything that we can't handle. He promises this in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 13, that no temptation comes our way, but such as is common to man, and that God is faithful, and He will not suffer us to be tempted above that which we are able to bear. You know, many of us are given to worry. We're given to looking ahead and saying, but what if this happens? Oh, but if this occurs? What if this happens? And we imagine all kinds of impossible situations that we'll never be able to handle. Brethren, that's a lack of faith. The Bible says that won't ever happen, that we'll be given more than we're able to handle. And so, we need to place our trust in Him. We need to love Him. And we need to keep His commandments. And we can live daily with an assurance, with a peace, with a trust, with a hope, with a joy that is only possible in living for Christ. And we encourage you this morning to begin living for Christ. We'd like to see you become a Christian. If you've never named the name of Christ, if you've never confessed Him to be the Son of God, if you've never accepted the remission of sins and the gift of the Holy Spirit, which He freely offers to those who will love Him, it's yours for the taking. It'll never be forced on you. It'll be because you freely decided in your own heart that this is the only course. If you need to pray God for forgiveness of public sin, if you would like to identify as a Christian, to work with us here at Channelview, and cooperate in God's plan for us at this place, the song that Brother Jerry has announced is to encourage you. And we hope you'll come and let us help you with your spiritual needs as we stand together now and sing.